And all right, when Yasser Arafat, when this whole nonsense started with Yasser Arafat was poisoned. Actually, it started way before they came out with the conclusion. I smelled a rat, and that rat wasn't just Arafat himself. That was a whole conspiratorial, rat. And I knew that they were going to try to pin this eventually down the road on Israel, and that's exactly what they're doing. Joining us now to talk about this is Dr. Paul Bonicelli. He happens to be Executive Vice President of Regent University and former delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. Hello, sir. Glad you could join us.
Steve, how are you?
I'm okay. Like I said, I smelled a rat from the very beginning because, this announcement a couple of weeks ago that, yes, he was poisoned. And this started a while ago, months and months ago, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Absolutely. The Swiss scientists were working on it for a while, and the media was eager to finally have a story, which they promoted for 2 or 3 days until it began to look kind of silly.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, nobody said anything. At first, they said, we're going to investigate this and find out how it could happen. We'll hunt down the suspects. And then it came out that folks within the Palestinian Authority were saying there is no suspect except Israel. It was Israel. It had to be Israel. And I said, even before they said that, but after the finding, quote unquote, I said, what's going to happen here is they're going to bank this for a while, and they're going to keep it and use it as a possible excuse for another intifada one day. All they have to do is announce, yep, it was Israel, they killed him, and then the intifada starts. Talk about, as your piece states, that if Arafat was poisoned, don't look to Israel, is what you wrote, and explain that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the first places to look is that snake pit of Ramallah. Why in the world wouldn't it have been one of the Palestinian leaders that were his rivals? I mean, the man had rivals his entire career, even to the very end, even when he was clearly aged and ailing from something. So there are a lot of possibilities. One possibility is they're trying to cover up that maybe he had AIDS. So the idea that it was Israel has motive, yeah. Israel has the ability, yeah. But that doesn't prove it, especially when there are so many other motivations and so many other bad actors in that region.
And as you write, we'll never know for sure. I mean, who are these doctors? Where's the proof? How are we going to find out whether or not he was poisoned? There was traces here. There were traces there. They supposedly dug up his old underwear. I mean, the whole thing, as you said, until they even the media, after a while, realized that this was kind of bizarre.
No, absolutely. And then they went out and checked with other polonium experts, and the one I read about made the most interesting comment. Well, it was a very difficult task for them. It was sort of like a scientist who grabs an elephant by the tail and tries to judge his weight by that. It's really hard to do, but there's a remote possibility you could figure out the way. This is absurd. And the Swiss scientists probably should have been clearer in their first report about whether or not this was really a strong possibility. But the media, as I said, they jumped on it and went for 2 or 3 days writing stories that sounded like this was really fairly reliable. And then by about day 4, they began to raise the questions, particularly when Israel spoke up.
Why would Israel, and you say they didn't, so let me rephrase it. Why wouldn't Israel want him dead? In other words, he wasn't that big a thorn in their side. I mean, they had worse problems, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there were downsides to assassinating him. Assassination is usually not a very good idea. I would say it's sometimes useful and sometimes helpful, but most of the time it just creates more problems for you. But Israel, by then, Arafat was not that big of a factor. He was definitely a thorn in our side and a thorn in Israel's side, but it is not as though he was a crusader leading armies anywhere, and was fairly well contained in his little hovel there in Ramallah.
Now, in your capacity, sir, and by the way, we're talking to Dr. Paul Bonicelli, Executive Vice President of Regent University, former delegate to the United Nations General Assembly, and you were nominated by President Bush and confirmed by the Senate to serve as Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean, overseeing all foreign assistance programs in that region. And so let me ask you, when it comes to this administration and what you're seeing happening, we could talk about, spend an hour talking about world politics and what this country, what this administration has done to our relationships in the Middle East. But particularly, let's focus for the moment on Israel. I mean, I wouldn't put it past this administration to never rule out that it couldn't have been Israel that poisoned Yasser Arafat. I mean, here what we found out in recent days is that John Kerry, and not only publicly rebutting what Prime Minister Netanyahu has said about a possible Iranian deal, but behind closed doors, according to senators who were there, bad-mouthing Israel and Netanyahu to the senators. So, I mean, and it was William Crystal who told me that United States relations have reached an all-time low. I mean, is this a huge area of concern for you?
Absolutely. When the French are Israel's best friends in the world right now.
And the Saudis, possibly, too.
And the Saudis, absolutely. I mean, I'm grateful for the French position here. It's a Gaullist position. Charles de Gaulle, I like that whenever they can sort of rub our face in it and be more prominent on a particular issue. I think the French also have a lot of relationship with the Saudis, and the Saudis, of course, are fearful of Iran. But this is of a piece with this administration's entire approach to the Middle East, particularly the Israel-Palestinian problem. They pretend like these are two morally relative positions, and that we need to be in between them, sorting it out. No, Israel is a democracy. Israel is our ally. It is impossible for the United States to be on the wrong side of this and anything good to come. And so your first question about would the Obama administration ever rule out Israel did this? No, I don't think so, because they'd like to look like they're playing fair on this, and I think that's a mistake.
And now when
the Middle East, I was going to say the Arab powers only respect a strong U.S., and we need to act like that.
Yeah, and also before I let you go, without having you weigh in based on your position at Regent University, which of course offers degrees from a Christian perspective in many different fields of endeavor, this administration and its attack on religious freedom has got to be another area of concern for you in that capacity.
Huge area of concern, in addition to not defending people around the world for their religious rights.
Well, the Christians who are being slaughtered all over, the Middle East and parts of Africa, and it's the Muslims attacking them, burning churches and schools. Yeah, and our media is silent, our government's silent, the world is silent. That I'll never understand.
No, you're exactly right. It's open season on Christians, whether they're Coptic or evangelical or whoever they are. It's a real shame because, again, it promotes weakness, and this is a national security issue. This is not just about religious liberty. I care a lot about that, but it's also the security of the United States and how we're perceived by our enemies. And right now we're perceived as weaklings. Yeah,
absolutely. Listen, a pleasure talking to you, Doctor. Thank you very much.
You too, Steve. Thanks.
Take care. Dr. Paul Bonicelli, Executive VP of Regent University, former delegate to the United Nations General Assembly, here on the Steve Malzberg Show. I told you. I mean, there are certain things that there are no-brainers. And understanding how the Palestinian PR machine operates and has always operated, and how the media will acquiesce and just nod in agreement and take anything that the Palestinian and the Arab PR machine, when it comes to presenting Israel in a negative light, they hunger for that kind of information. So when they get it, they eat it up without question. They don't look to see if there's any fat on it. They don't look to see if it's cooked. They just eat it up because they are hungry and starving for anything anti-Israel they could get their hands on, for the most part. Not all media outlets, but generally speaking. So when this Arafat poisoning came, I knew it had disaster written all over it, and we have not seen or heard the end of this story. As I predicted, they're banking this. Now they've already made it clear. They've decided that it was Israel. This is the Palestinian leadership. Israel's the only suspect we heard, and now they put that away. So when they need to pull out an intifada, that'll be one of the major contributing factors to the next intifada. I hope it never happens, but when and if it does, that will be brought up. Israel poisoned Arafat, and believe me, that'll be taught in every classroom that the Palestinian children go to, along with kill the Jew. The Jews are pigs and monkeys. We'll take Jerusalem with our blood, all that kind of stuff. And that's the sickness of the Palestinian society. And that's the sickness of ever thinking Israel can make peace with the Palestinians. They don't want peace. Netanyahu just said yesterday, we want peace. Let the Palestinians first, which they now have backtracked on, which they have never really done, but now have said they won't. They won't accept Israel as a Jewish state. Netanyahu said yesterday, I forget what I was watching, CNN, Candy Crowley. That's what I was watching before getting on my airplane to come home. My airplane. On the airplane to come home. He said, hey, we want peace. Let the Palestinians show they want peace. Let them start by saying, yes, Israel is and will be a Jewish state. That's too much for them. That's too much for them because they don't believe it. They believe in a two-state solution. And their idea of a two-state solution are two Palestinian states. The state of Israel, which maybe they'll consent to even keeping it called Israel. The state of Israel, which will be overrun by Palestinians because they envision a right of return, which is all the Palestinians who they say were kicked out of Israel when Israel was formed, kicked out of their land, quote unquote. Well, those original people who were quote unquote kicked out, and every ancestor, every offspring, every the generation that would have come from their loins will have a right of return. So Israel will become overrun by Palestinians, and then a new Palestinian state right next to it. So there's your two-state solution. Two Palestinian states. One of them could be called Israel, but it's not going to be a Jewish state. Jews will become the minority, and then they'll be treated, the way every other country treats the Palestinians in their country. It's sick. The whole thing is sick. And again, when you have a culture where your kids are taught from birth, from the kindergarten, from watching TV, like our kids watch Sesame Street and Mickey Mouse, when their Mickey Mouse tells them, we will kill the Jews, we will take Jerusalem with our blood. What do you expect the kids to grow up to be? Now, these prisoners who were released by Israel foolishly. Shame on Israel for releasing these murderers with blood on their hands who killed Israeli civilians, okay? Even killed a Holocaust survivor, one of them, with an axe, and he got released. They were welcomed home as heroes. And the Palestinian kids get trading cards with their pictures on them. They name soccer stadiums after them. They name sports teams after them. And this is who the kids grew up worshiping. Suicide, homicide bombers who kill civilians. How could you have any kind of negotiation with a society like that? Why would you want to have anything to do with a society like that? The textbooks, worse than the Saudi textbooks. What can I say? But the Saudi relationship, the reports now are that Israel and Saudi Arabia are plotting and planning to possibly bomb Iran. They have found the commonality of survival. That's what they found. Because neither Israel nor Saudi Arabia can count on the United States anymore. So they found each other, reportedly. How's that for strange bedfellows? I ask you. When we come back, we're going to have our friend Christopher Parker. Oprah says criticism of Obama